USPAP, page 150. Advisory Opinion 29 continued. Determining if an individual is an appraiser's peer requires examining the individual's expertise regarding each of the elements that define the assignment. For example, solely having expertise in appraising the same type of property is not sufficient to make someone an appraiser's peer. Application. The scope of work is acceptable when it leads to credible assignment results. The scope of work rule establishes two benchmarks for measuring the acceptability of the scope of work, both of which need to be met. The scope of work is acceptable when it meets or exceeds both, number one, the expectations of parties who are regularly intended users for similar assignments, and number two, when an appraiser's peers' actions would be in performing the same or a similar assignment. An acceptable scope of work must satisfy both benchmarks. Illustrations. Number one, an appraiser has been engaged to perform an exterior-only appraisal of a single-family property for a potential home equity loan. Another appraiser has been asked to appraise a single-family property in the same development for an FHA loan. Since the subject properties are similar, would the assignments require the same scope of work? Answer: no. The subject of the assignment and its relevant characteristics is just one of several assignment elements that define an appraisal problem. Because of critical differences in the intended use and the appraisal problem to be solved, the scope of work that is acceptable for the first assignment would not be acceptable for the second assignment. For example, an appraisal performed for an FHA loan is subject to additional inspection requirements. Number two, a state-certified general appraiser is appraising a highly specialized industrial facility and is concerned that the assignment is so complex that many appraisers who are knowledgeable about industrial property would not be qualified to judge whether or not the scope of work was appropriate. Who would be considered the appraiser's peers in this assignment? Answer: the appraiser's peers for this assignment would be other appraisers competent to complete a similar assignment. If special expertise is required, other state-certified general appraisers without the required expertise and knowledge would not be the appraiser's peers for this assignment. Identifying appraisers with expertise and competency in appraising similar complex property types or unusual intended uses may require seeking appraisers from other geographic areas. Number three, a business appraiser is engaged to value a 25% minority interest in the equity of a small privately held company for estate tax reporting purposes. The standard of value is fair market value, as defined in the tax regulations. The engagement requires that a second appraiser meeting the definition of an appraiser's peer be retained to review the work and to opine on the value of the subject interest. Another appraiser is experienced in valuing companies in the same industry, but typically appraises them for purposes of sale, valuing 100% of the equity, and has never performed appraisals of minority interests for estate tax reporting purposes. Is the other appraiser an appraiser's peer for this assignment? Answer: no. Part of problem identification for a business appraisal includes identification of the extent to which the subject interest contains elements of ownership control. Part of the appraisal process includes analyzing the effect on value, if any, of the extent to which the interest appraised contains elements of ownership control. Individuals who meet the definition of appraiser's peers would need to have expertise and competency in valuing minority interests. Additionally, the fact that the second appraiser has not performed appraisals for the same intended use could also render him or her to not be a peer in this assignment. Number 4, an appraiser has agreed to complete an assignment in the next 2 days. While conducting research, the appraiser discovers that the primary data source for the assignment, a regional computer database, is offline and will not be available for 3 days. What is the appropriate course of action? Answer: if an appraiser is unable to perform research that the appraiser's peers would conduct and intended users would expect, the appraiser must modify the assignment to allow time for the research to be conducted or withdraw from the assignment. Page 151, Advisory Opinion 30, AO-30. This communication by the Appraisal Standards Board, ASB, does not establish new standards or interpret existing standards. Advisory opinions are issued to illustrate the applicability of appraisal standards in specific situations and to offer advice from the ASB for the resolution of appraisal issues and problems. Subject: appraisals for use by a federally regulated financial institution. Application: real property. The issue: in order to comply with Title 11 of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989, FIREA, the federal financial institutions regulatory agencies of the United States have adopted appraisal regulations and guidelines. These laws, regulations, and guidelines are established to protect federally insured depository institutions and include the requirement that appraisals be prepared in compliance with the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, USPAP. What are an appraiser's obligations when performing a real property appraisal for use by a federally regulated financial institution? Advice from the ASB on this issue. Recognition of assignment conditions. USPAP creates an obligation for appraisers to recognize and adhere to applicable assignment conditions. The appraiser's identification of the intended use and intended users drives the applicable assignment conditions. The relevant laws and agencies, appraisal regulations, and guidelines are assignment conditions for real property appraisals for use by a federally regulated financial institution. These assignment conditions include, but are not limited to, the following: laws, principally Title 11 of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989, FIREA. Regulations, primarily the following agency appraisal regulations: Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC, 12 CFR 34, Subpart C. Federal Reserve Board, FRB, 12 CFR 225, Subpart G. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, 12 CFR 323. National Credit Union Administration, NCUA, 12 CFR 722. Guidelines provided in the agency's bulletins and issuances, including documents such as interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines, independent appraisal and evaluation function, frequently asked questions on residential tract development lending, frequently asked questions on the appraisal regulations and the interagency statement on independent appraisal and evaluation functions. The guidelines identified in this advisory opinion are subject to change. Appraisers are cautioned to communicate with their client on the current guidance that is applicable in a given assignment. Reference can be made to the website of the applicable federal financial institutions regulatory agency for these documents and more information on current bulletins and applicable issuances. USPAP applicability. A client that is a federally regulated financial institution expects compliance with the applicable regulations and guidelines. An appraiser's obligations are established in the course of considering and accepting an assignment. Appraisers must recognize and adhere to assignment conditions that apply in an assignment to satisfy the following USPAP requirements. Number 1, the preamble requires that appraisers develop and communicate assignment results in a manner that is meaningful and not misleading. Number 2, the ethics rule requires that appraisers perform assignments ethically and competently. Something about the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC, Federal Reserve Board, FRB, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, and the National Credit Union Administration, NCUA.